Schools and colleges are supposed to be places of learning, laughter, and memories. But for some students, they became something far darker. Late night whispers in dorm rooms, footsteps echoing in empty hallways, and shadows that don't belong. These are not just stories, they are real encounters students have never forgotten. Tonight, we'll dive into 3 creepy TRU student horror stories that will make you think twice before staying late on campus. The first night on campus always carries a strange mix of excitement and unease, and for Daniel it was no different. He had finally moved into his dorm room, a small square space with 2 beds, 2 desks, and a single window that overlooked the campus courtyard. His roommate hadn't arrived yet, which left him alone to unpack in silence. The building itself was old, the kind of structure with long creaking hallways, faded wallpaper, and pipes that groaned late at night. Still, Daniel told himself it was all part of the charm of living on campus. He arranged his books on the desk, set up his lamp, and stretched out on his bed, trying to imagine what the next few years of his life would look like. As the evening settled, the hallways outside grew quieter, doors shut one by one, and the muffled chatter of other students slowly disappeared. By midnight, the dorm had sunk into stillness. Lying in bed, Daniel stared at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the radiator. He had almost drifted into sleep when he heard something faint, a whisper so soft he thought it might have been the wind slipping through the window cracks. It was low, drawn out, and seemed to come from the corner of the room where shadows gathered. He sat up, blinking into the dim light from the street lamp outside, but nothing moved. Telling himself it was just nerves and the stress of a long day, he lay back down and tried to close his eyes. Minutes later, the whisper came again, clearer this time, like someone murmuring just beneath their breath. The words were impossible to make out, but the tone was deliberate, almost as if whoever it was wanted him to listen. Daniel froze, his body stiff against the mattress, his ears straining in the silence. He glanced toward the door, half expecting to see someone standing there, but it was shut tight. The sound didn't seem to come from the hallway anyway. It felt like it was inside the room itself. A chill crawled down his spine as he pulled the blanket tighter around himself. He told himself it had to be a neighbor through the wall, maybe someone talking on the phone or whispering in their sleep. Yet as he pressed his ear closer to the wall, the whisper seemed to retreat, shifting location, drifting closer to his bed as though circling him in the darkness. His heartbeat quickened, the stillness of the room pressing down heavier than before, and he realized he was no longer sure he was alone. Daniel woke the next morning groggy and unsettled, convincing himself that the whispers from the night before were nothing more than exhaustion playing tricks on him. The day passed in a blur of orientation activities, meeting classmates, and exploring the campus, but the unease clung to him like a shadow he couldn't quite shake. By evening, when he returned to his dorm room, he noticed small details that made him pause. The air felt cooler inside than in the hallway, almost damp, as though the walls held on to something the sun couldn't burn away. His roommate still hadn't shown up, leaving him with the growing sense that the room belonged more to the silence than to him. He tried not to think about it, distracting himself with his laptop and the muffled sounds of laughter drifting up from the courtyard below. As night settled in, the comforting noise of students outside faded, and the building seemed to exhale, leaving only the creak of floorboards and the occasional distant slam of a door. Daniel climbed into bed, determined to sleep early and brush off the tension. For a while, all was quiet. He closed his eyes, listening to the hum of the radiator again, and his breathing began to slow. Then, from the corner of his vision, he caught the faintest flicker of movement. His eyes snapped open, scanning the shadows near the desk. Nothing. Just the outlines of furniture made strange by the glow of the streetlight seeping through the blinds. He forced himself to relax, but soon after, the whisper returned. It was clearer now, close enough to stir the hair at the back of his neck. The voice sounded as if it were crouched at the far side of the room, low and steady, but every time Daniel tried to focus on the words, they dissolved into a hiss. He sat up, whispering a shaky hello, hoping for some rational explanation, but the room answered only with silence. Seconds stretched on, heavy and sharp, until he noticed something even more unsettling. The shadows on the wall didn't align with the light. One shape in particular lingered, taller and darker than the rest, angled as if it were leaning toward his bed. He blinked hard, rubbed his eyes, but when he looked again, it hadn't moved, and he realized the stillness of the shadow was far more terrifying than if it had Daniel barely slept that night. his mind racing with the memory of the whisper and the shadow that seemed out of place. By the time the sun broke through his blinds, he was almost relieved, though his exhaustion weighed heavily on him. He convinced himself again that he had imagined it all, but the thought didn't hold as strongly as before. He went about his classes, trying to push the unease aside, yet every hallway and every glance over his shoulder carried the sensation of being watched. The other students laughed and settled into campus life with ease, but Daniel felt more and more like an intruder in his own room, as if someone else was already living there, just beyond the reach of sight. That evening, he decided to study in the library instead of returning early to the dorm. The building was massive, lined with rows of shelves that seemed endless, the air heavy with the smell of old paper. He stayed until the sky outside turned black, packing his bag reluctantly when the librarian began shutting off the lights in certain sections. The walk back to his dorm was quiet, the campus nearly deserted, and Daniel felt the familiar chill crawl up his spine as he neared the old building. When he opened the door to his room, everything looked the same, but something felt off, as though the air itself resisted him stepping inside. He tried to shake the feeling, unpacked his books, and set them on his desk before crawling into bed. The room was colder than it had been the previous nights, and he wrapped himself tightly in his blanket. Minutes passed in silence until he heard the whisper again, but this time it was different. It wasn't scattered or faint. It was a single word, drawn out in a low, deliberate tone, though he couldn't tell what it was. His breath caught in his throat as he sat up, eyes darting across the room. The voice didn't repeat itself, but something else caught his attention. His desk chair, which he clearly remembered pushing in earlier, was now pulled out slightly, angled as if someone had been sitting there. The stillness of the room wrapped around him, and he couldn't decide what was worse, that something had been in the room with him, or that it was still there, waiting in the silence. Daniel began to dread returning to his dorm each night, yet curiosity and fear kept him from leaving. He couldn't bring himself to mention what was happening to anyone else, worried they'd laugh or accuse him of letting stress get to his head. By the fourth night, exhaustion had set in, but no matter how tired he was, the moment he entered the room, a strange energy seemed to stir, like the air itself was holding its breath. He tried to distract himself with headphones and music, turning the volume up high to drown out any sounds, but the whispers had a way of slipping through. They were faint at first, soft enough that he thought he was imagining them, but soon they layered over the music, crawling into his ears as though spoken directly behind him. He ripped the headphones off and spun around, his chest tight, but there was no one. Determined not to give in, Daniel sat at his desk and began sketching in a notebook, something he often did to calm himself. The pencil scratched against the page, steady and rhythmic, until the sound of a faint thump broke the silence. He froze, the pencil hovering above the paper, and turned toward the closet door. It stood slightly ajar, though he remembered shutting it earlier. His pulse quickened as he stared at the gap, his mind running through every logical explanation. Maybe he hadn't closed it properly, maybe air pressure shifted it, maybe anything but what his gut told him. The whispers stirred again, low and fragmented, seeping out of the shadows near the closet, words too distorted to understand. Summoning what courage he had, Daniel stood and approached the door, each step heavier than the last. He reached out slowly, fingers trembling, and pushed the closet door wide open. Nothing, just his clothes hanging limply and a few boxes shoved into the corner. Relief mixed with dread, because the moment he turned away, the door creaked behind him and edged shut by itself. His body stiffened as if the air had turned solid around him. He didn't move for several seconds, listening, waiting, his throat dry. Then the chair at his desk slid back with a sharp scrape across the floor, the same chair that had moved the night before, and Daniel realized he was not dealing with coincidence or imagination anymore. The library had always felt like a safe space to Daniel, but after the unease in his dorm room grew heavier each night, he found himself staying later and later among the towering shelves. The silence there was different, not oppressive like in his room, but vast and watchful, as if the rows of books themselves were listening. On the fifth night, he lingered long after most students had gone, settling deep into the stacks with a pile of notes and a desk lamp casting a small circle of light. For hours, the only sounds were the turning of pages and the occasional shuffle of the librarian in the distance. Then, as the lights in the far corner clicked off one by one, Daniel heard it, the distinct sound of footsteps echoing faintly across the floor. They were slow, steady, and deliberate, too heavy to be another student trying to slip past unnoticed. He froze, his pen held in midair, his ears straining. The steps grew closer, the rhythm unbroken, yet no shadow crossed the end of the aisle. Gathering his nerve, he leaned out to peer down the row, but the corridor stretched empty, illuminated only by the dim overhead lights. When he pulled back into his seat, the footsteps stopped altogether, as if whoever it was had been waiting for him to notice. He tried to convince himself it was just the old building settling, the echoes of pipes or creaks in the floor, but the sound had been too distinct, too human. He packed his notes quickly, his hands shaking. When the footsteps resumed, this time circling the stacks as though tracing the aisles in deliberate loops. The lamp flickered once, briefly dimming the circle of light around him, and he felt the prickle of dread crawl up his arms. He stood, his bag slung hastily over his shoulder, and began moving toward the exit. With each step he took, the unseen footsteps followed, always a row behind, never visible no matter how often he glanced around. The silence between the echoes pressed harder against him, filling his chest with panic. When he reached the front desk, the librarian was nowhere to be seen, the room empty as if abandoned. Only then did the footsteps stop, leaving Daniel in a silence so deep it rang in his ears, as though whoever had been following him was standing just beyond the threshold of sight, waiting for him to leave. Daniel returned to the dorm that night with his nerves frayed, his thoughts tangled between disbelief and dread. The silence in the hallway seemed thicker than usual, the kind that presses into the ears until every sound feels magnified. He slid his key into the lock with trembling fingers and stepped inside, bracing himself for whatever waited within. The room greeted him with the same unnatural chill, a damp cold that had no business lingering in late summer. He flicked on the light, scanning every corner, his eyes darting to the closet and then the desk chair, both of which stood in their proper places. For a moment, relief washed over him, but it was shallow and brittle, unable to last. He dropped onto his bed and buried his face in his hands, exhausted yet alert, desperate for rest but terrified of what the night might bring. Minutes passed in stillness before he heard the faint sound of scratching, so soft he thought it might be his imagination. He held his breath, straining to listen, and the noise became clearer, rising and falling in uneven bursts. It wasn't coming from the hallway or the ceiling. It was inside the room. His gaze swept across the floor until it landed on the far wall, where the paint looked slightly darker, as if damp. The scratching grew louder, like fingernails dragging against the plaster from the inside. Daniel's skin prickled as he stood slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. He moved closer, pressing his ear to the wall, and what he heard made his stomach twist. The faintest whisper slipped through, muffled but distinct, layered with a rasping scratch. It sounded like someone trying to speak through the barrier, their voice broken and desperate. He staggered back, his heart hammering in his chest, and grabbed his phone to turn on the flashlight. The beam revealed faint lines etched into the paint, shallow grooves he hadn't noticed before, running vertically like claw marks. His pulse thundered as he reached out to touch them, half hoping the texture was an illusion, but the rough ridges under his fingertips confirmed it was real. The scratching stopped the instant he touched the wall, leaving the silence heavy and expectant. He backed away, his breath shallow, keeping his eyes fixed on the spot, but the wall remained still and ordinary, as though mocking him for ever doubting his sanity. That night, Daniel lay awake with the light on, listening, waiting, knowing the silence was only temporary. By the seventh night, Daniel was running on fumes, his body heavy from sleeplessness, yet his mind refusing to rest. The whispers and scratches had worn him down, leaving him caught between believing he was losing his grip or that something truly sinister had taken notice of him. He sat at his desk staring at an unfinished page of notes, the lamp buzzing faintly above him, when he realized the usual nighttime hum of the dorm was missing. No muffled conversations through the walls, no footsteps in the hall, not even the faint sound of doors shutting. The silence was unnatural, too complete, and it wrapped around him like a suffocating blanket. He tried to focus on the page in front of him, but his pen slipped from his hand as the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before, as though eyes lingered just over his shoulder. His chest tightened as he slowly turned toward the closet. The door, which he had checked twice before sitting down, now hung open wider than he remembered. Shadows bled from the opening, darker than the rest of the room, pooling across the floor as if they carried weight. He stood carefully, each movement deliberate, and stepped toward the closet, trying to convince himself it was just his tired mind playing tricks again. But before he could reach it, the whispers began, not faint and scattered this time, but sharp and distinct, rising in overlapping voices that filled the room. They hissed and murmured from every corner, surrounding him, their words tangled and incomprehensible, yet carrying a tone that made his skin crawl. Daniel stumbled back, pressing against the desk, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. The lamp above him flickered violently, casting the room into brief flashes of light and shadow. In one of those flickers, he saw it, a figure standing in the closet, tall and still, its outline too sharp to dismiss as imagination. The light steadied, and the space was empty again, but the whispers continued, now layered with a low, guttural sound that seemed to rumble from the walls themselves. He pressed his hands over his ears. But it made no difference. The voices poured into his head, louder, closer, until the shadows on the wall began to stretch unnaturally toward him, as if they were reaching out to pull him. And Daniel didn't remember falling asleep, but when his eyes opened, the room was cloaked in an unsettling stillness, the kind of silence that made every breath sound too loud. The lamp was still on, casting its weak glow across the walls, though the light seemed dimmer, almost swallowed by the shadows that clung stubbornly to the corners. He sat up slowly, disoriented, his body aching from the stiffness of sleeping in his chair. For a few moments, everything felt normal enough to calm him, until he realized that the shadows weren't staying still. They shifted subtly, pulsing against the walls as if they had a life of their own. He rubbed his eyes, blaming exhaustion, but when he looked again, the movement hadn't stopped. Instead, one of the shadows seemed to stretch upward, detaching itself from the wall in a way that made his stomach lurch. His breathing quickened as he fixed his gaze on it, frozen in place, unable to rationalize what he was seeing. The shadow elongated, creeping toward the ceiling before bending unnaturally, its edges trembling like smoke yet holding a definite form. Daniel staggered back, his chair scraping across the floor, and in that instant the whispers surged again, louder and more insistent, as if they had been waiting for him to notice. The sound filled the room, words tumbling over each other in a frenzy, some too distorted to understand, others sharp enough to pierce through, his name, spoken in a voice that made his skin crawl. He stumbled toward the door, clutching the knob with trembling hands, but it refused to turn, as though locked from the inside. Panic clawed at his chest as he pulled harder, the whispers swelling, pressing into his skull until his vision blurred. He spun back toward the room, desperate, and saw the shadow pressing off the wall entirely now, looming with a grotesque shape that didn't belong to anything human. Its form wavered, but carried weight, spilling across the floor in thick tendrils that seemed to reach for him. Daniel backed into the door, his breath shallow and ragged, watching helplessly as the figure drew closer, the light from the lamp sputtering in its presence. The voices grew deafening, as if every corner of the room was alive, whispering and hissing, demanding his attention while the shadow towered over him. Daniel didn't leave his room the next day, though the thought of staying there gnawed at him, almost as much as the idea of stepping back out into the dim, echoing hallways. His eyes burned from lack of rest, his body heavy and sluggish, yet every time he closed his eyes he felt the weight of that presence pressing in. The walls themselves seemed to hum faintly, a vibration he could almost feel against his skin, and he found himself listening for it even when the room was quiet. By evening, the air had grown colder again, unnaturally so, and with it came the familiar feeling that he was no longer alone. He sat curled on his bed, knees pulled up, staring across the room at the closet door that refused to stay shut. He had wedged a chair in front of it earlier, but now the chair trembled slightly, as though something behind the door was pressing against it. He forced himself to look away, trying to drown out the tension with music from his phone, but no sound seemed able to fill the space. The whispers seeped back in, faint at first, then swelling until they drowned out the music entirely. The words were clearer now, layered with urgency, as if demanding something of him though he could never quite understand. His phone screen flickered, then died completely, plunging him into silence except for the insistent voices. His breathing grew shallow as he gripped the edge of the mattress, the lamp flickering violently until the bulb popped, leaving the room in darkness. In the pitch black, the voices rose into a chorus, circling him, overlapping, echoing from places that felt impossibly close. He couldn't see the closet, couldn't see the chair anymore, but he could hear the scrape of wood dragging slowly across the floor, the sound of it being moved aside. His stomach dropped as a low, guttural sound followed, something closer to a growl than a whisper. He fumbled blindly for his phone, shaking, pressing every button, but nothing lit the screen. The darkness felt alive now, shifting and breathing with him, and though his eyes adjusted slightly, he wished they hadn't, because in the far corner near the closet, he thought he saw the faint outline of a figure crouched low, waiting. Daniel had reached the breaking point by the 10th night. His dorm room, once just a cramped and unwelcoming space, had turned into something closer to a cage. The air inside was always damp, heavy with a chill that no heater could chase away. Every corner seemed darker than it should be, every creak of the building a reminder that he was not truly alone. His classmates noticed the change in him. Sunken eyes, jumpy movements, a silence that replaced his earlier excitement about starting college. But none of them could understand what he endured at night, when the whispers grew sharper, when the shadows stretched longer, when the walls themselves seemed to breathe around him. He thought of moving out, but the thought of explaining why, of sounding insane, silenced him every time. So he stayed, hoping the nights would pass like storms, only to find that each one left him more broken than the last. That final night began with an unnatural stillness. The campus outside seemed hushed, even the usual laughter and footsteps distant. Daniel sat with his back pressed against the door, as though his own weight could keep something from entering, or worse, from leaving. His lamp flickered weakly on the desk, fighting against the swelling shadows that clung to the corners. The closet door, though wedged shut with the chair, rattled softly, not violently, but with a steady persistence like fingers drumming against wood. Daniel tried to ignore it, tried to close his eyes, but the whispers rose again, louder, overlapping, spilling from every direction. He could hear his name repeated over and over, some voices pleading, others mocking, all blending into a chorus that made his skin crawl. The air grew colder until each breath left a visible cloud. Daniel's body trembled uncontrollably, not just from fear, but from something deeper, something that felt like it was draining the warmth from his very blood. And then the chair scraped aside on its own, slow and deliberate. The closet door creaked open, and the shadows surged outward like liquid spilling across the floor. In that moment, Daniel saw it clearly. Tall, formless, yet undeniably real, its edges trembling, as though it existed halfway between his world and something darker. It leaned forward, its shape blotting out what little light remained, and the whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar. Daniel screamed, though no one heard him. By morning, his dorm room was found empty. His belongings remained neatly in place, his notes scattered on the desk, but the chair was toppled over, and the closet door stood wide open. Some said he dropped out and left without telling anyone, too overwhelmed by college life. Others whispered that he had been claimed by the very presence that haunted him. The truth, like the whispers that plagued him, was left behind in the walls of that dorm room, where new students sometimes claimed to hear faint scratching and muffled voices late at night, warning them they are not alone. Thank you so much for watching and supporting this chilling journey through 3 creepy TRE student horror stories. Your time and engagement mean the world to me, and if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more terrifying tales that will keep you up at night. Stay safe, stay aware, and remember, sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that are true.